Imagine this. Someone's just, trying to make ends meet, borrows a tiny bit of money, and then bam, they're in a hole so deep they lose absolutely everything. Their house, their job, maybe even their freedom.
Yeah.
Sounds like, I don't know, something from Dickens, right? But this exact thing, driven by what we're digging into today, it's been a recurring tragedy
Yeah.
all through history.
Absolutely. Today we're diving deep into the long and often pretty damaging history of usury. Now, at its core, usury is really just charging interest on loans. Simple idea.
Simple, yeah.
But as the material we've been looking at shows really clearly, this seemingly straightforward financial act, it's had surprisingly massive and, yeah, frequently destructive impacts across different societies, different times.
Exactly. The sources we've got really shine a light on how this practice has left its mark. So our mission, our goal for this deep dive is basically to trace that thread, follow the impact from ancient times right up to the present day. We want to give you a clear sense of why it's always been such a hot button issue and, what the real costs have been for people. Okay, let's get into it, starting way, way back.
Right. So our exploration really kicks off in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece. And what's fascinating, what you see right from the very beginning, is that even in these super early civilizations, the basic problems with lending at interest, they were already there.
Yeah, like farmers, small traders, they needed loans.
Yeah. Exactly. They relied on them.
But it wasn't just seen as a neutral business deal, was it? The material suggests that even back then there was this feeling of potential exploitation.
Oh, definitely.
That the wealthy could take advantage of people with less, and it led to people losing their land, their way of life, everything.
Precisely. That's the key takeaway from this early period, I think.
Yeah.
This enduring power imbalance that's just baked into lending. Those with the capital could easily exploit those who were vulnerable and needed help.
It really sets the stage, doesn't it? This core dynamic. Having money when others desperately need it gives you immense power.
And charging interest, especially really high rates, it just immediately made existing inequalities even worse.
Okay, so let's jump forward. Middle Ages. Now, the whole discussion around usury gets this strong religious overlay, right? The Catholic Church famously condemned it, called it a sin. That feels like a really major moral stand.
It was huge, a powerful condemnation. Often the idea was based on this concept that money itself doesn't naturally, breed more money. So charging interest felt unnatural, unfair, a gain you didn't really earn.
Okay, so a sin. But what about trade? As economies grew, didn't people need credit more than ever?
Exactly. That created this real tension, a massive challenge. On one hand, the church is condemning all interest.
Yeah.
But in practice, well, trade is booming, people need capital. So various financial tools and, let's say, interpretations popped up.
Loopholes.
Kind of ways to lend money and get a return that maybe wasn't technically called interest, but it did the same job.
Ah, okay. So you've got this strong religious no clashing with a growing economic yes. And our sources mention these big banking families, the Medici, the Fuggers. How do they fit in?
Well, they essentially figured out how to navigate this. They found ways to get capital flowing, which was absolutely essential for these growing economies. The need to borrow and lend was just undeniable.
Right.
So while the church's rules set a kind of moral boundary, the practical world of trade and investment meant finance kept going, sometimes through really complex deals that skirted the strict definition of usury. And these families, they became incredibly powerful. Really shows the influence you get from controlling who gets credit.
Okay, so religious rules provided a framework, but the economy found ways around it. Let's shift focus now, maybe over to England. And the start of actual usury laws. Sounds like governments tried to step in and regulate interest rates.
Yeah, that's a critical development.
Yeah.
Secular attempts to regulate it, moving beyond just the religious condemnation.
But maybe not super successful.
Well, the intention was good, right? Protect borrowers by putting a cap on interest rates. But the sources, they consistently point to this problem. Loopholes. Always loopholes.
Always.
Especially when times got tough economically. The material mentions the Great Depression, for example. During crises like that, these loopholes basically allowed predatory lending to just carry on.
So the laws were there, but they didn't stop the exploitation.
Pretty much. They might have set a maximum rate, say 10%.
Yeah.
But lenders could just add huge fees, hidden charges, or structure the loan in a really confusing way that hid the real cost. It pushed a lot of people into poverty, even with laws supposedly on the book.
It's like playing whack-a-mole. You close one loophole.
Another one pops up. Exactly.
Okay, this next bit from the material really struck me. The connection between usury and indentured servitude. Can you unpack that? How did those two things get tangled up?
Yeah, this is where you see the really devastating human cost of this stuff. So 17th, 18th centuries, especially in the Americas, indentured servitude was a huge source of labor.
Right. People agreed to work for a set time, often just to pay for their trip over.
Correct. Passage to the New World. But here's the catch. Debt and the interest on that debt became the tool of control.
So someone takes out a loan, maybe for the boat trip, maybe for tools, basic supplies,
Hmm.
and the interest on that loan basically chained them to their employer.
That's exactly it. The interest rates were often incredibly high, so the initial debt just ballooned. It became almost impossible for someone to ever earn enough to pay it off during their contract term.
Wow.
It effectively trapped them, stuck them in forced labor. The source material, quite rightly, called it a form of enslavement through debt.
That's powerful. And it wasn't a system that hit everyone the same way, was it? The sources specifically mention marginalized groups being targeted, African populations, Native Americans.
Yes, absolutely. These communities were disproportionately targeted, often forced into these contracts under pressure or through outright deception. And they usually face much harsher conditions, even less chance of ever escaping the debt cycle. It was brutal.
So even though the transatlantic slave trade eventually took over as the main form of forced labor.
Right, that became dominant.
Yeah.
But these exploitative lending practices, the weaponizing of debt that we saw so clearly with indentured servitude, that reveals another really disturbing way people were controlled and oppressed. And those kinds of practices didn't just vanish.
It's a really chilling link, shows how financial tools can have these direct, brutal social impacts. Okay, let's fast forward to today. It might be tempting to think, okay, extreme debt traps like indentured servitude, that's ancient history. But our sources suggest predatory lending is still a massive problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, it really is, especially as the material points out in many developing countries.
Right.
Predatory lending is still a major issue. The material mentions interest rates that are just staggering, sometimes as high as 500%.
500%.
Yeah.
That's not even interest anymore. That's just theft.
It's almost impossible to comprehend, isn't it?
Yeah.
And these lenders, they often work outside of any effective government control. They specifically target vulnerable people, vulnerable communities, and it just locks them into these cycles of poverty that are incredibly hard to break free from.
So the underlying principle of exploiting vulnerability through debt, which we saw so starkly with indentured servitude, it's still happening, just in a modern guise.
Precisely. The lack of regulation or enforcement allows it to persist.
The material also touched on a couple of other historical links, like gambling in ancient Rome. How did usury play into that?
Ah, yeah, that's an interesting side point. It basically shows how debt can fuel other risky behaviors, and vice versa.
Right.
High-interest loans gave people the money to gamble. Gambling often led to bigger losses, deeper debt, more need for loans. It's a classic negative feedback loop. Creates more financial trouble, more social problems.
Okay. And then there's this other big point raised in the sources, the accusation really that even huge international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank have sometimes acted like predatory lenders,
Mhm.
imposing high interest loans on developing nations. That feels like a major charge.
It is, and it raises really critical questions about power dynamics in global finance. The argument, as presented in the material, is that these loans, with their conditions and interest rates, can sometimes create long-term economic dependency rather than helping countries develop.
So the debt burden itself holds them back.
That's the core of the criticism, that the burden becomes so heavy it makes it harder for them to invest in crucial things like schools, hospitals, infrastructure. It's a complex debate, but the sources definitely flag it as a concern related to large-scale lending practices.
It's a stark reminder that this isn't just about individual loans. It can have these huge geopolitical consequences. Now, the material does acknowledge something important. Charging interest is just completely embedded in our modern financial systems now, isn't
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. It's
Yeah.
fundamental.
It's hard to even imagine a modern economy without interest.
You really can't. Modern economies run on credit. Interest is the mechanism that makes so much possible investment, mortgages, business loans, growth. It's how banks function, how investment works.
So the challenge isn't getting rid of interest entirely.
No, not really. The critical challenge, and this goes back to everything we've discussed, is figuring out the difference. Where's the line between interest rates that are fair, sustainable, maybe even productive,
Yeah.
and rates that are predatory, exploitative, and destructive?
Right. Which brings us right back to the core problem, those potentially devastating consequences. Looking back at this whole history, ancient farmers losing their land, indentured servitude, modern predatory lending, even the international stuff, The impact of unchecked or unfair lending just seems consistently overwhelmingly negative.
It does. The historical record, as laid out in our sources, it just provides such compelling evidence. The potential for usury, or predatory lending, to cause widespread harm is undeniable. It's fueled poverty, forced labor, economic instability across so many different times and places.
So, what do we take away from all this today? The material kind of implicitly calls for action, doesn't it? Or at least recognition.
I think so. Recognizing the historical dangers is key. It really underscores why things like robust regulations are so important, especially to protect vulnerable people from predatory lenders.
And monitoring, keeping an eye on lending practices.
Definitely. Monitoring is essential to spot potential abuses early. And of course, education, financial literacy, helping people understand the real risks of high-interest debt, empowering them to make better choices.
Yeah, it feels like this history isn't just dusty old facts. It echoes really loudly in the issues of debt and inequality we see right now.
Exactly. This historical perspective isn't just academic. It's directly relevant to the financial challenges people face today. Recognizing these patterns helps us understand and hopefully address the financial exploitation that still exists.
It's amazing, or maybe depressing, how consistent that pattern of exploitation is across totally different eras and societies.
That's the central insight, isn't it? The persistence of the problem.
So, okay, let's wrap up this deep dive. It seems pretty clear that the history of usury isn't just some dry economic footnote. It's this recurring story, this narrative of how the power that comes with lending money can be twisted into exploitation,
Mhm.
with consequences that are deeply harmful and stretch right from the ancient world up to today. And that really leaves us, and you listening, with a crucial question to chew on. Given this long, often destructive history, how should we critically look at the role interest plays in our modern financial world?
Yeah, who really benefits and who's taking on the biggest risks in the systems we have now?
Or maybe think about it this way. If unchecked lending has caused so much damage historically, what kind of safeguards are actually truly effective at stopping the same things from happening again today? Definitely something to keep thinking about long after we finish here.